Welcome to anybody listening or watching this video. This is Phenomenal Conversation number 40 with Jessica Boehme, titled Eko-Philosophy, Rewilding the Mind for a Regenerative World. And we're going to unpack all of that as we go through the conversation. And before I ask Jessica to introduce herself, I'll just say a few words about Phenomenal Conversations. So Phenomenal Conversations contribute to regenerative worlding and regenerative culture by interviewing people such as Jessica that I feel are living the change, by trying to expand imagination in the midst of the polycrisis, by asking profound questions, and by trying to amplify nuance and meaningfulness in a chaotic world. And there's two formats. Today is a format which is a live format that there will be a subsequent group conversation. And the other format is about twice a month. I publish a one-on-one interview with change makers in a huge variety of disciplines. So with that in mind, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Jessica to the live event. And we'd love to hear something of your background. And then once we've heard that, we'll start to dive into rewilding, eco-philosophy, and regenerative worlding, as it were.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Yeah, so my background, I now find myself in philosophy and have a background though in mechanical engineering, so coming from a very, very different discipline. And after having worked in like big corporations and went down this road, I started researching about sustainability and did another study program in sustainability. And one of the core questions that came up for me quite quickly was, how do I live my life? Right. I saw, back then I wouldn't have, and this was like 15 years ago, and I wouldn't have called it like the meta crisis or poly crisis, but I saw these different crises. And my very first approach was actually to think, how can I address the most important issue and find a technological solution to that, because I was an engineer by background. So I looked at like probable water solutions in water management and in energy management. And I couldn't really find the sweet spot, and I felt like something was lacking there. And at the same time, while that was happening, what was also happening was that in my own life, or like in my personal life, I started to think like, okay, I know what I should be doing, so to say, in some terms, but why am I not actually doing that? And how can I actually implement like a sustainable lifestyle? And I started doing that, or trying and attempting to do that, and went into so many barriers. And like I saw how everything is connected with everything else, and I was just basically lost and trying to figure out, okay, how do I deal with that? And eventually this became more not just a question in my personal life, but my research was also then increasingly going into this direction. And the past couple of years, I have especially researched like relational approaches and relational ways of understanding the world, and seeing that as a key driver to a more sustainable or regenerative future or futures. And what actually came to me quite late was that what I was practicing and doing was philosophy in a sense, and not necessarily philosophy in the academic sense, but philosophy as this very practical sense of how it used to be, or what it used to be, at least is how I understand it at one point, where it was really a practice about intentionally practicing how to live well and identifying principles and then trying them out in the real world. And for a very long time, I was searching for this one philosophy that I could live by, and eventually noticed, okay, I'm never going to find it. And that's actually quite a recent aha moment that I had, of noticing there is no one philosophy that I will find where I will, commit to 100% and say, okay, these are the principles, because it's always changing. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But yeah, that's sort of how, from mechanical engineering to sustainability, and then especially in the field of transformation research, I ended up finding myself in philosophy and in the in the mess of that.
So that's interesting, and I would call that a kind of natural or practical philosophy. How did that differ from what you read or what you came across in terms of these different systems you studied? What's different, would you say, about that approach to?
Yeah. So what I first studied and what I was really getting into was relational paradigms or worldview or philosophies, whatever you want to call it, where they would offer basically relational ideas of how to think about the world in a relational sense.
Yeah.
And the first aha moment was when I was wrapping up my PhD, which was about relational worldviews and paradigms, and I noticed I was researching about them, but the method that I applied and how I approached that was actually not relational, but I was
Right.
going down a
Okay.
very conventional research path.
Yeah.
And this was towards the end of my PhD, and I was like, damn it, like I could do this whole thing all over again.
Right.
Which really got me into the world of thinking about research differently as well, which I
Yeah.
now find super, super interesting, and it's taken quite a lot of my mental capacity, so to say.
Right.
And what I found in general is, in so many fields, and this is an ongoing debate in sustainability science, at least, of like knowing what we should do different, or like having, even if we have a philosophy that is more conducive to a regenerative world, that doesn't necessarily lead to change in any way, or to a practice and to something that's really lived in our everyday life, or to a lifestyle.
Okay.
And I was always fascinated with lifestyles, and always found that the way we approach the whole discussion about lifestyles is often superficial. Like it's,
Yeah.
well, what do we consume, and being green consumers or so on, but it wasn't really going to the heart of it.
Okay.
But I think philosophy and lifestyle, this combination,
Yeah.
which to me at the beginning, or when I thought about it, I thought like, it hasn't really found each other yet. But then I noticed actually it has, and
Oh,
philosophers
okay.
have been doing that
Yeah.
like thousands of years ago, and somehow we've forgotten this
Yeah.
connection. And what I see nowadays is that we often talk about how our philosophies need to be different, but there is not necessarily the idea involved of how do we actually practice that in our
Yeah.
everyday life.
That's almost like a little bit of a classic dilemma in academia. There's the theory. You
Yeah,
could say, the philosophy and the theory are somewhat analogous to one another, but does it work in real life, or how does it work, and how do you practice it?
yeah,
And so it seems like you were finding that messy middle between what was spoken and what was recommended and what was actual.
yeah.
How maybe even your colleagues lived, or your people pursuing the philosophy they espoused or not. What would you say about that uh, kind of phenomena in the middle
Hmm.
there? What would
Yeah.
you?
So I think this is a huge problem in general that I saw in sustainability science, even apart from the philosophical part. But the
Yeah.
sustainability scientists, we would talk about it all the time, but it wasn't a lived practice in the
No. No.
workplaces that I was part of. And
Yeah.
politicians would blame the consumers would blame the companies again would blame the politicians. So it was basically just a row of finger pointing. Instead of seeing like how we are ourselves part of a system. And this was
Yeah.
something that this relational understanding of the world, instead of this very mechanistic view that I,
Yeah.
especially as a mechanical engineer, was so ingrained with that. It was such a huge part of my identity, which really helped me to understand myself also in these relations differently. But for example, what I also see is that, this relational approach is often quite hyped, or these relational
Yeah.
philosophies of like,
Yeah.
yeah, we just need to see how we are all connected to everything else.
Yeah.
And I see that, but when I try that out in my real life, to be honest, like sometimes I think back to the time when I was just this little part and, had my mechanical view of the world, and I was pretty happy actually in that view. I was living quite a great life actually, until I saw all these difficulties
Mm.
and how I was entangled with everything else. And
Yeah.
suddenly I was like, well, can I drink this coffee? Can I buy this pair of jeans? I want to see my friends across the ocean. So every decision basically became sort of a burden. So this whole idea of the relational worldview, as great as it is, and as much as I support it, and it's a more adequate reality, but at the same time, it doesn't lead to an easier life or necessarily to a more happy life. And if we kind of keep forgetting that or kind of push that negative part of it out, then that philosophy is not necessarily going to work in or be applicable to real life.
I think I admire your, you've kind of like found a kind of meter, as it were. You are a meter for actually how practical and applicable these things are, and I think that's really interesting. But for the listener that maybe be unfamiliar, or the person watching that's unfamiliar, could you just unpack what you mean about a relational paradigm and relational? Because I think that underpins this, and I think it's not that familiar to some people who might be listening.
Yeah, and there's, of course, different ways of understanding that. One of the papers I did was mapping the different discourses around relationality, and we identified, just in fields, like 15 or 16 different fields that talk about relationality. And I think the basis of it is to understand that we are connected to everything else, and that every human is part of a living system, which is beyond the human, includes the more than human, our landscapes, etc. And that there is these ideas of having us as individuals as like separate beings that can exist in any way independently from the rest of the world is really an illusion. So one of the underpinnings, and there is different ideas about like how our ways of being, in terms of, in philosophy you would talk about our ontology, would be questioned in terms of we're not these separate individuals, but we are something which are more sometimes called dividuals or transviduals or so we are always relational beings. And the way we know things, for example, it's very much based on a scientific understanding of the world and trying to see everything on a rational level. And a lot of the people who engage with relational thinking also notice like, we also have emotions. There's a lot of things that are not, we are not able to measure that count in our, or that have a huge impact on us. So I think the easiest way to understand it is in terms of, we are connected to everything else. And what I find super interesting is that if we keep that connective level, or if we think about these connections on a global level, we can keep it to our very physical senses. On a physical level, I'm connected to the Amazon through the coffee that I drink, for example. But when I take it a step further even, and then go to the cosmic level and ask myself, how am I connected to the universe? Then suddenly it's almost inevitable to become a metaphysical question of like, okay, what's the purpose of the universe? And then what's the purpose of us as human beings in the universe?
Well, those are big questions, and somehow I'm not sure that they're quite so explicit in modern day philosophy. I mean, there has been a number of trends in the public eye, as it were, trying to fill in the hollowness that we've been talking about, the in-betweenness, like Julian, I think it's Boehme, the guy that founded the School of Life, Alain de Botton, and then also Stoicism has kind of been trending, and metamodernism. What's your view on these emerging trends and how valuable they are?
Yeah, that's very hard to say. I think where I see the value, or the greatest value, is not so much in the particular answers that they are giving for these cosmologies or for these ideas, but that they are bringing back these questions into our consciousness. So I think a lot of these questions, sometimes we talk about timeless wisdom, for example, and philosophy or indigenous philosophies or any philosophy, that it's ideally timeless wisdom. But I think wisdom is not necessarily timeless because it's very context dependent and it's really changing. Like the Stoic
Yeah.
context, for example, was very specific and their philosophy was ideal for the situation they were in, which was quite precarious for a lot of people around that time. So a lot of them actually didn't live a good life in the sense of a comfortable life, but they really
No.
faced a lot of hardships. So for them, developing this sort of Stoic philosophy of where they develop a thick skin was very adequate for that time. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that's maybe why it's coming up again in today's
Yeah.
time, because we're also facing really precarious situations in many
Yeah.
parts.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily a good philosophy for people who are, living in complete privilege and comfort and don't have to necessarily worry about these things. For them, it might be a different philosophy that's
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
more working. But in general, that they are bringing back these questions, and I think these
Yeah.
questions are timeless about like, who are we? What's our role? What's our purpose? What does success mean? And for example, and how do we want to show up in the world? How do we want to care for the world? So I think, yeah, that they are trending is also a sign that maybe we are searching for that. And sometimes I think about self-help. The self-help market is booming, and I often
Yeah.
think about self-help as like almost like a first entry point, a superficial level to these bigger questions,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
trying to show us of like ways to self-transform. But where it's lacking, I think, is often to ask those deeper questions, because in self-help, in classical self-help, you don't ask what success is. It tells you how to become successful, but not to
Yeah.
question first, what does it
Yeah.
even mean?
Yeah.
So adding this layer of depth, which I think is so necessary in today's time, where these old models just don't work very well anymore,
Yeah.
at least if we
Yeah.
want regenerative futures. I think that's super important.
Yeah. Well, really enjoying that answer. I think I particularly resonate with this thing about, the cosmic questions of, and in a way, that's sort of what is the energy behind this series. Although I've got a funny story to share that I think everybody will enjoy. We were talking about timeless wisdom. I was in a warm data lab 2 weeks ago and people were sharing their stories. And this young woman said, well, my father had one piece of wisdom that he always shared and it was always right. And that piece of wisdom was things never turn out the way you expect. So that's a sort of classic one that probably you could never be wrong on. But it was amusing to hear that from a young woman about her father. So one of the things that I think when I read your writing and talked to you and the way that you're speaking is there seems to be a lot of consistent effort in self-reflection. So I'm kind of interested what you have to say about this as a practice or a practice that becomes a way of being. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I sometimes try to reframe it for myself of like self-reflection. There is this idea of diffraction instead of reflection, which I really
Okay.
like, because reflection basically just gives you back what's already there. So it's reflecting the exact
Yeah.
same.
Yeah.
Ideally, in each process, when we somehow engage in these, what we typically call reflective practices, we actually change something. So in
Yeah.
physics, it would
Yeah.
then be diffraction more than reflection.
Diffraction. Okay.
Diffraction, yes. Um, but yeah, so that's one thought that came to my mind of like, I think it is, or for me, it's become this very important practice to take my time for that. And I think this is one of the keys, that is really taking time
Yeah.
to do that, and to have a clear way of thinking, or a clearer way of thinking. It's
Yeah.
never really clear. And on the other hand, what I'm noticing is that the self-reflection works so much better when I don't do it by myself.
Okay.
So
Right.
doing it in conversation, and it could be with other people, it could sometimes also be in conversation with the more than human world. So I'm practicing what that looks like
Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah.
on my everyday life. But to because if I just stay with my self-reflective thoughts, it is more reflective practice in the sense of it does not change so much, maybe because I can continue to stay in my head.
Right.
So as soon as I talk to other people and I get a little bit of input, and I think what these sorts of conversations also bring forth in so many beautiful ways, is that
Mm.
suddenly it becomes this group mind where we could have never thought of these things by ourselves. Mm.
Well, that's interesting. I think I hear something around the object of reflection. So somehow, if the object of reflection is your limited self, you're going to get limited answers. But if you're expanding the range of sources that you reflect on, you open up to different kinds of information, as it were. Yeah.
And I think, so for example, I have a dog, so I go for a walk with my dog almost every day, and I try to take her into the park or into a forest or so. And just being there kind of changes the state of my mind.
Yeah.
So then I will get different insights just because the state of my mind is different.
Yeah.
Then, if I stay at my desk in the same setting where I'm always at, then it sort of produces the same results. So maybe that's also a way to kind of be in communication or be in a reflective practice with the more than human world, and to engage with that.
Cool. I've got a friend that believes he's communicating with the trees as well. So he has a sense of them as energetic entities. Okay, to move on just a little bit more, one thing that I haven't heard too much from you but you're developing, especially in academia, is these philosophy gyms. So please, could you explain to us what it entails and a little bit about what you do and what the end result or the desired end result is?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, this started out at just a call that I put out on the internet a year ago, where I then found myself in a group of, we started out with 8 people. We are still consistently doing this once a month that we meet in those philosophy gyms. And it's really become this collective sense-making space where we try to make sense of what's happening in the world, what's happening in our own lives. And then sometimes we are trying to take away practices that we want to take with us into the next months. And from there, it's been evolving quite a bit. So I work at the university, so I've been applying for a research grant last year to develop philosophy gyms with organizations or in the context of organizations and companies. And fortunately, we were granted the funding. And what we are doing there is in a group with 5 different partners across the EU that we are developing philosophy gyms for companies in order to basically help employees to get into these reflective spaces in the context of regenerative futures. So to not just think, or to the ideal version of it, or one of the initial ideas was to, companies also have a lot of obligations of being told, yeah, you have to do that to be sustainable, and you have to follow these laws and these regulations. But it's similar. I see it as if I'd be told, yeah, you can consume so much, or you should switch to a vegan diet, or what have you, don't fly, like these regulations that I could put on myself, which say on a very superficial level, but just as I myself, inquire into the deeper layers of it and give a completely different sense and meaning to the whole idea of regeneration, of what it means to be alive. I think the same level of reflection could be useful in companies as well. So we are developing formats to bring these processes or these deeper reflective processes into companies. And we actually just the last 2 days, we had a meeting in Berlin. We were all meeting for the first time face-to-face with the partners. And it's a great combination because we are 2 professors who are, have this academic mindset and are very heady in a sense. And the other partners are coming from a very practical side. So one of them, for example, is the Industry and Trade Chamber from Bulgaria. So, so they have, all the experience with actually working with companies. And the whole time they were like, so we have to answer the question, what's in it for me? What's the benefit for the company? And break it down into these very tangible solutions which speak to people. And, if I come with, so let's talk about our ontology or epistemology. Look at me like, are you crazy? So it's but I don't know yet completely what it's going to be. I mean, it's still very much in the process of developing, and I'm super excited to see what what it will be. But at the moment, it still has this very experiential character.
So what do you think might be a different effect, say, than from a conventional training and development or communications program that a company might buy from
Yeah,
somebody in the market? What do you
yeah.
envisage being different?
What I noticed, so we've done so far, we've done now 50 interviews with different companies and done quite an extensive desk research. And what we identified were a number of, I think in total it was like 100 and something skills that companies are saying what they need in these times. So it
Yeah,
would be
yeah.
from we need resilience, self-reflection, empathy, cooperation, self-leadership, etc.
Mm.
And the way I see it is that these skills, if I sometimes this iceberg model, I find it super helpful. And the way I see it is that skills are on the behavioral level. So they are rather on top of the iceberg of what I'm
Yeah,
actually seeing. But
yeah.
what's underneath that is, from how I understand it, our philosophy. So, these deeper questions of, for
Yeah.
example, what is success? Who am I, etc. That these deeper questions inform so much our skill level. So I think
Oh,
whereas other
okay.
companies might, sell the skills and the individual skills, but there are so many of them and it changes. I mean, this year resilience is a skill to learn, and next year it's going to be compassion, and then it's going to be empathy, mindfulness.
Metacognition or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. So at least the way I understand it, philosophy is basically something that's underneath those different skills, which
Okay. Yeah.
enables them to choose which of these skills do they maybe want to focus on, but to really as an empowering tool for making their own choices. And if I think about it, like philosophers have, ancient philosophers, and not maybe not even so ancient, but they have really influenced how we are thinking about the world today,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
in this very mechanistic way. So how do we change that if we do go to philosophy? It just makes sense for me. And at the same time, I hope not to see that there will be 5 to 10 people who are great philosophers who influence everyone's thinking again. That's to
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
that's like an outdated way, but rather each of us somehow collectively contributes to that. So it becomes this hive mind, which means though that all of us have to become philosophers in a sense. And to exaggerate, of course, not everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's of course my specific lens.
So
Yeah.
there's a kind of co-sharing and co-responsibility for developing a living philosophy as an organism, a living
Yeah.
organism, as it were.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Yeah.
And so I was interested then, you talked about relationality, another sort of buzzword that's about in learning circles, but also I think is kind of the antidote to philosophy or cognition and thinking alone is sort of embodiment. But I'm kind of interested in your thoughts is that, okay, philosophy primarily involves the exercise of the mind, but
Mm.
how do you see it becoming embodied? How do you see that? Is it being grounded? Like you've mentioned this, grounded in practical life as it's being lived according to a lifestyle or the
Yeah.
lifestyle you've chosen. So how do you see this opening or that happening, occurring?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's and something I'm still grappling with in a sense, because to me, philosophy has never been just about the mind, but it has always been very much in relation and as an embodied practice.
Yeah,
Um, I'm I'm actually just since a couple of months I've started to learn more about somatics and what that even means. And I've
yeah,
came
yeah.
across this beautiful model of the she calls it PEMSA, our PEMSA body, which is physical, emotional, mental. There's relational in
Spiritual, is
it,
it?
spiritual, and
Yeah,
yeah, and
relational
relational.
or
Yeah,
something. Yeah,
yes, and I absolutely love that we are this, yeah, spiritual being, physical being, etc. So the way I see it, if philosophy stays just in the mind, it's not really practical philosophy for me, but it
yeah,
becomes
yeah,
really philosophy. And I think, at least how I understand it, that a lot of philosophers actually did that. They did take it into their everyday life and made it into a practice. Like some, for example, would really include, in the Stoics as well, would include the body as like really exercising the body.
yeah.
And I think where this is still quite prevalent is, for example, in yoga, which,
Yeah,
has a specific philosophy. We then ideally practice it on the mat and then take it into the world. So,
yeah, yeah,
and it has all different sorts of different modes.
yeah.
For us, philosophy has become simple, simply this mental practice. But, sometimes when I'm dancing, it's more philosophy than anything else. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating because um, we've talked about these different dimensions about philosophy gyms in business. We've talked about the gap between what's said or suggested and what's lived, and then also about embodiment and reflection. So I was curious how this picture adds up to the idea of eco-philosophy or rewilding philosophy, just to
Hmm.
tie those threads together.
Yeah.
How would you explain? I'd be delighted if you'd explain the connection between those threads.
Yeah. Maybe I start with rewilding because it comes a
Okay,
bit
yeah,
easier, and hopefully from a bit what I've said, it's already a bit apparent. So that rewilding philosophy came, or this term came to me first of all because the wild somehow gives this ecological context,
yeah,
but it's also because I do see it as so important that we take it out of this dusty old academic
yeah,
uh yeah sphere that it's been in for so long. So give it this wild touch again, which
yeah,
and not this cleanliness. And then the eco, and specifically spelled with a K, it's something that is grounded in this idea that I do have my foundations in a relational philosophy.
yeah,
So taking in this ecological approach, systems approach, but at the same time, I don't think, we are all just relational beings and it's all just about ecosystems, but we are
no,
also individual beings. So we also
yeah,
have an ego, and I don't want
yeah,
to dismiss of that ego. So between the ego and the eco with the C, I thought, yeah, the eco with the K is maybe somehow situated between the two.
okay,
And to, yeah, the ecological is such an important aspect. And at the same time, the way I think it's understood is maybe not all there is. So with a
yeah,
K,
yeah,
I try to differentiate,
yeah, yeah,
relate and differentiate at the same time. That makes sense.
okay. And this the use of the K
Hmm.
uh, are, is is that a kind of trying to position philosophy not at one extreme or the other? That's what it sounds to me.
Yes.
That's what you're aiming towards, as it were.
Yeah. So I'm sitting with this tension still in my work, that on the one hand, I think it's not helpful to prescribe one philosophy
Yeah,
because each one, and I want to rather be supportive of processes that are, that help people find their philosophy, and to be practical, or to put practical philosophy in the center and not one specific philosophy. At
yeah,
the same time, I do see how there is real ecological boundaries that I can think away. Like they are just so prevalent for me, and like in my idea, it's very hard to find a philosophy that basically doesn't take into account the ecological aspects.
yeah,
So sometimes I think about it, philosophy is often termed as a practice to getting in right relation to reality. And the
yeah.
ecological boundaries that we have are for me just so real. And maybe there is a world, and to get all metaphysical, maybe
Mm.
maybe there is a world where the ecological boundaries are just something that's made up in our minds, but that seems so far
Yeah,
away from my lived experience that I
yeah.
want to have that. I think in any real philosophy has to have this understanding of that we live on a limited planet and that we do cause harm if we overstep some of these boundaries.
Well, that's fascinating. I know I thought we were tailing off, but I've got one more question there because I think there's something that I've noticed, but I'm not totally that well informed. But there's the philosophy as the planet as a living system
Mm.
to be in right relationship to and to take care of, restore, regenerate. And of course, that's implicit in all indigenous philosophies, but most modern philosophies and some ancient also don't have that in the picture. What's your perspective on the inclusion of our habitat
Yeah.
as the domain for where the philosophy is occurring, as it were?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is interesting. I see it in some Western ancient philosophies as well, but it has been so much more prevalent in indigenous philosophies, why I
Yeah,
think, and I think that's one of the reasons why they are having like a comeback, so to say.
yeah,
But if we look, for example, at the Stoics that you mentioned, they were also very much concerned about creating good citizens. So they were very much looking at people in relation to the polity and to the
yeah,
ecosystem, basically, that they were part of. They didn't have the same ecological, or they weren't, yeah, these systems ideas of which some indigenous cultures, for example, have, of how everything's connected and the ecological impact. It wasn't so prevalent for various reasons. But
yeah.
it's not that it wasn't there. It just kind of was pushed to the to the margins in our ways of
Yeah, it was
approaching things.
probably taken for granted it was always going to be that way in some
Yeah,
respects.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, Jessica, thank you so much. That's been really, really delightful to explore with you. So I'm going to switch modes and go into gallery, and then we're going to see maybe what needs to happen next. Okay, we're now in gallery mode, and I thought that might be, before we go into a pause, I thought it might be a nice time, if you've got questions, to put those to Jessica, and then we could go have a pause and go into a dialogue between the five of us. So has anybody got anything they'd like to ask Jessica about? Yes, go ahead, Erica, and then Francesca.
Jessica, I hear a lot about ancient philosophy, and knowing that in the ancient days, the highest context they looked at was their community, really a city. How different do you think that philosophy has to be to see our planet and an ecosystem, or even at the cosmological level, that switch to seeing things at that higher context? Is that a major difference? Does it need rewilding and recreation, or do you find that you can apply it the way it is?
No, I think it needs recreation. And that's why I think that philosophies, like they don't offer timeless wisdom, like I mentioned before, because it really, the context has changed. And so I think we can build on some of these ideas, and definitely they are helpful. And there's so much wisdom that we can get from there. But this idea of just applying that, I think is, yeah, well, and in my understanding, it doesn't work. What I see and what I find beautiful is that there is actually, if there is actually a convergence happening. So, taking some ideas from indigenous philosophies, some from Asian philosophies. I mean, especially if we talk about mindfulness or so, that's such an important part, and I think so helpful for so many people. And also Western philosophies have a lot to offer. So I think this convergence of these different philosophies, and at the same time, even that I think won't be enough, because the context has changed so much. And now with AI, I think it will be changing even more. So we have to ask even, again, different questions. So I think there's learning from them. And I think, though, there is more learning in seeing how they approached and how they came about those philosophies. So the process that's behind it, instead of the answers that they offered.
Wonderful. I love that
So-
focus on the dynamics there then.
Mm. Francesca?
Thank you. The wonderful presentation work that you're doing.
Thank you.
I'm really curious about what challenges you're coming up against with bringing this work outside a more sympathetic bubble that knows what relationality and embodiment and things like that are, and out into the wider world,
Yeah.
especially in the business context that you're working in. Like, Feels
Yeah.
like languaging is definitely a part of it,
Yeah.
because one of that metaphor of the iceberg makes complete sense. The skills that everyone's wanting to develop and package up and put out there, and yet what's below that? But when you use the P word, philosophy, as below that, I'd
Yeah.
love to hear a bit more about your experiences of that, some anecdotes, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's been
how's it
quite
going?
a wild ride while
Yeah.
it's been ongoing. And yeah, I mean, I've switched contexts. I've even tried to get rid of the word philosophy at one point where I thought, is it smarter to get rid of the word? Should I use a different wording? But then, words are a way of worlding as well. And there is so much, just the word philosophy, for me, there's so much in it somehow. And so it doesn't feel right to get rid of that. And yeah, the challenges that I face. So now with the business context, it's nice that I have partners from the business world who are very situated in this business world, who are, and at the same time open to these questions, that they want to develop something with us to make it tangible for people who are outside of these bubbles. But when I do talk to people, yeah, a lot of them, for just in, short encounters or so, my experience is that either they are deeply fascinated and they get it quite quickly, or they are really alienated by it. So it's often these two poles. There's not so much in between. And for example, I'm teaching in study programs on mechanical engineering, so technology management and business programs, MBA programs. They all have usually a background in some sort of engineering, and then they just want to do the business part. And a lot of them come from have an international background, and they come here, want to do the MBA and want to work for like Tesla and Volkswagen and these big often automotive sectors. So it's a very, very different world. And I try to bring these ideas into or to them and see how they connect. And there I see also like 50% of the students are deeply fascinated by it and interested in it. And then there are some who are not interested in it at all. So I see how it's quite a divide. And yeah, I mean, my personal ambition is to really bring this into, and I think this is coming back to rewilding, of like really bringing this back into a more more approachable context. And I think what's interesting for me is to not just do that with individuals, even though I see so much potential in doing that with individuals, but I would love to really see that institutionalized, because like I briefly mentioned before, these things take quite a lot of time and energy, and I don't know how we find that time and take that time in our personal lives apart from everything else that's going on. So I think, if this was part of institutions, of workplaces, of universities, of schools, then it would have a very different meaning and place in the world again.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Can I just ask you a quick question? Just quickly,
Francesca.
following up on that. Is there a particular experiential exercise that you use in this group context that works to get some of the people who are unsure about the wording into it?
Not so much yet. So what I do, I mean, it always depends on the context, but so far the people that I have mostly worked with, I had quite some time with. So I do start from the whole perspective of the meta crisis or the poly crisis, or the challenges that we are facing, and have that as the entry point to, okay, and then why do we bring it down to philosophy, and what's the link there? And basically coming from the cognitive understanding. And that's also, I think, if I was to use experiential settings, for example, with some groups, I think this could work really well, like doing a meditation or so, or some, somatic practice. If I talk for example, to my students, or now in the business context, I notice the more data I give them, the better. So one thing, for example, that I did in the workshop that I showed, that the participants loved, just 2 days ago was showing them how when we press in Wikipedia the first word, after like the 7th word or so, it always ends up with philosophy. So there was a study done showing how basically all Wikipedia articles, if you press the first word, you end up with philosophy after the 7th degree, the latest, or something like that. So, and this was giving them some very concrete data of like, yeah, okay, it comes down to philosophy. And I see how they love that. So coming from this academic, heady angle, I think is really helpful in order to bring something that's actually not about the head in my understanding, but starting with that in order to open the interest for that.
A notion occurred to me when you were describing that you're rewilding engineering as well.
Yeah.
So I think unless there's any more questions, we'll close. Oh, one more. Yes, please go ahead, Erica.
I have one more, just because I do come more from the organizational and engineering background. So I'm a software coder and have been leading teams in that context for a couple of decades. And as I go through my personal rewilding, I have had quite a few conversations with groups and teams where I really just start by having people define their own context so that they can understand the relationality of where they're already sitting. And that can lead sometimes into that philosophy as well. Have you had any success bringing people up from their current experience?
Hopefully. If that answers that. Yeah, but I find it very hard to tell sometimes. Yeah, maybe I leave it. If that's okay.
More things we can't measure.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pause the recording for a short 5-minute break. Then we'll come back. Jessica, you and I can think of a question we can pose, or think of a question that's arising, or we can, if anybody's got a question we can all explore, then we could maybe see that. We can sort of have a selection process for a question we want to pursue. But let's take that 5-minute break and then come back then and turn the cameras on, etc.